And now it is our pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, who is perhaps the world's leading urbanist, a thought leader on economic competitiveness, demographic trends, and cultural and technological innovations. Author of international bestsellers, The Rise of the Creative Class, that's all of us, Who's Your City? He is advisor to government leaders, diplomats, economic development organizations, and Fortune 100 companies. His latest book, The Great Reset, explains how new ways of living and working will drive post-crash prosperity. The director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, global research professor at New York University, and the founder of the Creative Class Group. Esquire has named him its annual list of the best and the brightest, and Fast Company dubbed him an intellectual rock star. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming author, thought leader, and researcher, Richard Florida.
Ah, yes. Well, looky here, what do we have? Another pretty thing ready to grab.
Thank you both for that incredibly kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for having me here at this fantastic gathering. Look, we are living through one of the greatest economic and social transformations in all of human history. You see it happening in San Diego, you see it happening in San Francisco, you see it happening all across this country. If you look at the events of the past decade, just think back, roll your mind's eye back. The terrifying economic and financial crash, 2008, which fortunately we are now recovering. The stock market's recovering, the housing market is recovering. The tech crash and bubble that so vexed the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area in 2001. Of course, the problems of terrorism and geopolitical issues that we're dealing with in the United States and all across the globe. These are not epiphenomenal. All of these events are tied to something very deep and very fundamental that is shifting our economy, and many have grappled with it. But it's not only shifting the way companies compete, the way your organizations compete, the way our economy functions, what government needs to do. At the bottom of this transformation, why it's so important we're all here together this morning, at the bottom of this transformation is a deep and fundamental transformation in the way we live, in the way our communities are constructed, in the way our great cities like San Diego and others compete in the global economy. You see, in my book, The Great Reset, that you were kind enough, the Davidsons were kind enough to mention, in my book, The Great Reset, I was able to trace back these tumultuous, these troubling, these disturbing, but also great transformative times of economic competitiveness and opportunity. And I dubbed it the Great Reset because at the moment the world economy looked to be deepest in trouble. At the moment all of us were struggling with housing and building and finance. Jeff Immelt, the CEO of General Electric, stood up on the stage and said, you know what? What we are going through isn't an economic crisis. It's a reset. It's a fundamental reset of our economy, of our culture, of our society, of our psychology, the way we think. Those who understand the reset will prosper, and those who don't will be left behind. Quite a prophecy he made early on, and now with 4 or 5 years behind us, we can see the contours of where this great reset is taking us. When I wrote that book, I looked back at history. I looked back at our history in the United States and the history of other great nations. I scrolled back through centuries. And what I found that every time our economy shifts, every time we go through one of these economic and financial traumas, I've grown to dislike the word recession and depression. I've grown to really become attached to this word reset. When I looked at what happened in the 1930s, the great crash of '29, when I looked at what happened in the 19th century as we shifted from an agrarian nation to an industrial nation, I found that we not only embarked on periods of great innovation in this country, we not only created whole new industries like steel and electronics and chemicals and automobiles and semiconductors and information and biotech, of course we did, We embraced those gales of creative destruction. We embraced startup and entrepreneurship. But what I found that was key to reset, it's not only our technology leaders in places like the Valley, out in La Jolla here in this town, around great universities, Austin, Texas, Seattle, Boston. It's not only the Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and our dynamic innovators that power this economy. What really powers us from crisis to recovery, the motor force of our economic structure, and I'll talk about this in detail today, is how we forge and build our communities. People talk about Keynesianism. They talk about government stimulus and spending. And the government did a decent job in mitigating the worst effects of this crisis, for sure. Could have done some things differently, but on balance, the government helped us recover. But when I look back at the New Deal, what I found, it wasn't FDR's efforts to remake our economy that paid off. And when I looked at the 19th century, it wasn't new ways of government intervention. It was the way we build our cities and communities. What powered our economy in the 19th century was not just innovative new technology, it was the movement of people from farms to cities. And our ability to construct great cities like San Diego, San Francisco, the invention of the cable car, the creation of new infrastructure and new ways of living that created demand that powered those new industries. The Great Depression. It was the rise of a new way of housing our people. What we called at the time suburbanization. The creation not only of a city, but of a suburban metropolis. But my parents participated, buying their first suburban home in 1959 as they left Newark, New Jersey, along with tens of millions of other Americans. When my mom and dad bought that suburban home, they bought a brand new Chevrolet. And they filled the house with RCA TVs and air conditioning units and radios and refrigerators, creating a new way of living, created the fuel which powered the industrial engine of our great factories. But folks, I'm here to tell you today that the transformation we are living through is greater than both of those combined. We're living through the greatest economic transformation our nation and our world has ever seen, because for all of previous human history, all the millennia, when economists and social scientists and social theorists and great leaders and great business people looked at the sources of economic growth, what did we know? If you wanted to grow your economy, you had to develop your three core factors of production. Till the land, harness the physical labor, and add capital. We grew because we settled around great waterfronts, right here in San Diego. We created natural ports and harbors. We developed natural agricultural system around fertile soil. We harnessed oil and coal and iron ore in that great belt that runs from Pittsburgh in Ohio through West Virginia, up to Michigan, and throughout our great industrial belt. But something happened over the past couple decades, right? The ability to achieve success in heavy industry, the things that powered America's growth, that made America victorious in two great world wars, they stopped being our source of economic advantage. Nothing wrong with that. We saw a shift of industry initially from cities to suburbs. Then we saw a shift from suburbs to Sunbelt, and then we saw our great industries begin to move offshore. Today they call China, the world's leading center of industrial production, the globe's factory. But our economy didn't collapse. We didn't put our head in the sand. Here in San Diego, in this great state of California, all across the land, even in Pittsburgh and Detroit and those industrial belt cities, we began to revive and to rebuild. But this time, not around physical things, not around raw material, not just around resources, not just around big, heavy industrial complexes. We began to remake ourselves in a new way. That's what my work is about. And it's that change in our economy that pulsates and transforms not only the way our businesses and communities and regions and countries compete, it's that fundamental transformation from an older industrial economy and society to something new, which is changing the way we live and work, changing the ways our communities are built, and changing the ways all of you in this audience will do your business. And like Immelt says, those who get it will survive, and those that don't will fall behind. Well, people have speculated on the dimensions of this transformation. Some said we were moving from a manufacturing to a service economy. Others said we were going to a post-industrial something or other, a technology age, an information age, a cybernetic age. Peter Drucker, the great management theorist, said we are becoming a knowledge economy. Well, all of those theories are right. And get this. Today, less than 1 in 5 Americans does a blue-collar job. They work in a factory. They work in transportation and the moving of materials and goods. They help maintain our industrial might. They work in transportation, construction, and blue-collar fields. 6% of Americans, 6% of our workforce actually touch things in factories. We are shifting to a new mode of production where it's not manual labor that powers our economy, where mental labor and the mind itself has become the means of production. And it is this rise of the mind as the means of production which changes the way we compete and work and live. I call it something else. It's not just a knowledge economy. It's not about the knowledge we acquire in school, is it? Some of our greatest entrepreneurs, like Jobs, like Gates, like Dell, dropped out. It's not the information we create. It's not the technologies we build. There's something deep and fundamental that every one of us in this room shares. Man or woman, regardless of our ethnic background, our age, our physical size and stature. It's something that not only we share. You know, the great Robert Sternberg, the psychologist, in his Handbook of Creativity, says if you look at a great entrepreneur or business builder, you look at a great manager, you look at a great doctor or lawyer, you look at a great philanthropist, you look at a great writer or musician or artist, you look at every little boy and girl on a playground, you look at our kids and our grandkids, our friends and our relatives. The things that all of us share is not our knowledge and information, it's our human creativity. But what's happened is that human creativity is not just the stuff of books and arts. It is the core purpose and driving force of our economy. It's what lies behind all of those propulsive, innovative industries, of which Apple, of course, or Google, or Facebook may just be the most illustrative examples. You see, I've charted the rise of the creative class. That creative class was virtually zero 100 years ago. 100 years ago, more than 50% of Americans worked on farms. A growing number of us took up work in factories. Less than 5% of us worked in what I call the creative class: science, technology, engineering, innovation, entrepreneurship, arts, culture, entertainment, media, and the knowledge-based professions: law, healthcare, management, and business. By the year 1950, we had become a fully industrialized economy. Now 50% of us worked in factories. We were a blue-collar world. Less than 10% of us were members of the creative class. Between the year 1980 and today, we have undergone this economic tsunami, this great transformation, this great reset. Over the course of that time, more than 25 million new jobs in America have been created in the creative sector, for the creative class. Now more than 40 million of us work as members of this great class of artists, innovators, cultural creatives, entrepreneurs, techies, managers, healthcare professionals, educators, and researchers. More than a third of the workforce. In this city of San Diego, in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, nearly 40%, and in the city cores of those areas, in the dense urban nexus of those areas, like this downtown, in downtown San Francisco, and Manhattan, and downtown Boston, upwards of 50 to 75% of the workforce is already members of this class. When the US unemployment rate hit more than 10%, when the rate of unemployment in construction topped 25%, when the rate of unemployment in manufacturing was also in the double digits, The rate of unemployment in the creative class never topped 5%. As we tragically continue to shed manufacturing jobs in this country over the next decade, although we've stopped the hemorrhaging. It's not millions anymore, it's hundreds of thousands, and we may even keep them constant. As our share of workers in production, in direct production, the people who make things, reduces itself to 5%, about the share that worked on farms in 1950. We're going to add another 10 million jobs in the creative class over the next decade. This is the growth force of our times. Those who understand the creative class, the trends it set in motion, the more than $3 trillion in wages and salaries it brings home, 50% of all wages and salaries in the United States, the fact that this class controls 75% of discretionary income, this is the trend-setting class. This is the class, not young people, not millennials. It's not a demographic explanation. It's this class that works with our minds. Young and old, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, gay and straight, married and single, able-bodied and disabled. It's this great class of people. Just as my father's working class shaped the trends of his day, this great creative class shapes the trends of our day, and understanding how it thinks, understanding how it works, understanding what it demands is key to understanding our time. Now, one little footnote. For those of you who may be skeptical, for those of you who may think this creative class is just yuppies and trendoids and libertine people who live in urban centers, it's not important to my business. Let me tell you how important it is. You see, I didn't learn about the creative class from studying urban hipster areas or latte bars, or multiculturalism. I learned about it by studying the best factories in the world. During the 1980s, I wanted to understand how the best factories were competing and winning, and how other factories were closing and deindustrializing. I went and visited every great factory in this country. I went all through Europe and all through Asia. And one day, I stopped in Nagoya, Japan, and talked to a supplier of Toyota. And the plant manager told me something that continues to echo through my mind and help me to write my books. He said, Professor Florida, with all due respect, we're going to win and you're going to lose. He told me this in 1984, 1985. He said, we're going to top the big three. And I couldn't believe him. I was beyond cynical to skeptical and more. He said, the reason is not you have a bigger market than us, you have better raw materials than us, you have a bigger country than us, you have great workers. The reason lies in the way you manage. You see the worker as a hand and a back and a brawn in physical labor. We figured something out. These workers on the factory floor, they are the means of production. And it is their intelligence, their knowledge, the ability to mobilize their social mind. In Kaizen is the word they used for it, continuous improvement, from tens of thousands of workers across our supply chain, which allows us to innovate and win, even though you have better CEOs and better research departments and better engineers. And I'll tell you where I really learned it. I learned it from my father. My father was named Louis Florida. He was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants. My dad didn't get to go to college. He didn't get to find himself. My dad went to work at age 13. The day he turned 13, in 1934, in the middle of the Depression, he excused himself from his junior high school classroom, put his books down on his desk, and went down to Newark and took his working papers. Went to work in an eyeglass factory called Victory Optical in the great ironbound section of Newark, New Jersey. He worked there until that fateful day in December when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He put his tools down on his workbench and he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He stormed the beaches at Normandy and fought in all the great battles of World War II. He came back after the war. Guess what? He went right back to work in that same factory. And he got married, and he had two boys. Myself, Richard and Robert. Great Italian names, you know, Richard and Robert. Classic Italian names my parents gave us. They wanted us to assimilate. They wanted us to be part of the melting pot. They didn't speak Italian at home. They wanted us to get an education. They enrolled us in Queen of Peace School, where we were the Queensmen, taught by the Sisters of St. Joseph's. Here are the bruises on my knuckles to prove it. I wanted to understand what my dad did for work. Like any curious kid, I wanted to see where he worked. And remember, in the 1960s, we didn't have take your sons and daughters to work day. My dad said, Rich, you can't come to the factory. I work in this factory, so you don't have to. It's your job to go to school and get good grades and get an education. I work in this factory so you can get ahead. Education is the key to success. My mom and dad both told me. Well, I would continue to badger and pull at my dad's pants legs and beg him. And on Saturdays, when the factory was running overtime, he would relent. By this time, my dad had worked his way up to be a foreman and ultimately the working plant manager of the entire factory, Victory Optical in Newark. And we'd take that ride. And I know some of you are from New Jersey, because we New Jerseyans are everywhere. We would take that ride, which literally looks like the same drive Tony Soprano takes in the opening scene of The Sopranos. He goes over that giant black Pulaski Skyway. And I can tell you where I grew up. I say euphemistically, it was a suburb, North Arlington. But it was right literally in the heart of Sopranos country. And I grew up talking like this: how you doing here in San Diego? This is a beautiful place, and the building and the construction and the financing. I swear to God, I got a scholarship to Rutgers College where I learned English as a second language. We'd take that drive and we'd enter the factory, and imagine this giant brick factory filled with Italian Americans and German Americans manning the machines, and Puerto Rican, Latino people, African Americans, Polish, Irish, the full suite of the melting pot that makes this working melting pot that makes this country great. And I was always interested in technology. I've been a student of technology. I've written books on technology. My first book was on technology, Silicon Valley style, competitiveness in manufacturing, studied factories, so it made a big imprint. My dad would see me looking at the machines injecting the plastic frames, or the plating machines plating the gold and silver frames. And he said something to me that now I've learned from every great CEO and business leader that I've gotten to meet in the course of my career, but I heard it from my dad first. He said, Rich, it's not the machines that make the factory great. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of the people that work here. That's our economic raw material. And our job in America now is to extend this, creative class. You know, the lucky third of us, and my God, our kids and grandkids, nieces and nephews, that are so gifted to be able to work with our minds, to not have to work in that factory. And I worked in factories in my high school days and college days, to be able to work with our minds, to express ourselves, to find meaning and purpose. Lord knows in San Diego, the fact that 40% of your population, in this great state of California, 4.5 million people get to do this work. Across America, 40 million of us, but it ain't enough. The real challenge of our time is to extend this, because we know it. The places that are going to compete and win, the cities that are going to compete and win, the states that are going to compete and win, and ultimately the countries that are going to compete and win, are the ones that can draw out the creativity of everyone. From that factory worker to the bus driver to the people taking care of us in this great convention center and our hotels, the people who serve us, and look at the transformation in our food. Look at what's happened in the food industry in this state. Talk about the example of a creative field. Farm to table. We ate at one of the great San Diego farm to table restaurants last night. Think about the transformation of agriculture. You guys heard from the head of Stone Brewing, some of you, the leaders. Micro brews. Not only coffee is $4 a cup now, micro brews are $5 or $6 a bottle. Think about the Napa Valley and the Sonoma Valley. We've turned agriculture, and now we have to turn services and the entirety of our economy. And we're falling behind. Other countries like Sweden and Singapore and the Netherlands are ahead of us. But that's our agenda. How do we deepen this economy? Because creativity is the great leveler. It doesn't understand gender, cuts across, doesn't understand any of the social categories we've imposed on ourselves, doesn't understand race, doesn't understand ethnicity, doesn't understand sexual orientation or family type. You know, in that Silicon Valley, the place we hold up is the great epicenter of innovation. This is where I learned it, interviewing the great venture capitalists and tech leaders. You know that 50% of the people there building businesses were not born in this country. That's the stuff. Creativity requires diversity. And this brings me to my second point, which is much more closer to what all of us do for a living. You see, going on this journey and understanding that creativity is the source of economic growth, I discovered something else. Maybe it's because I'm a kid who grew up in Newark. Maybe because I'm a working class kid whose dad worked in a factory. Maybe it's because I saw the city where I was born go through traumatic decline. Maybe it's because I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years and saw Pittsburgh's trauma. Maybe it's because my wife, Rana, who's here today, is from Detroit. And we watched what happened there. But the second thing I was able to discover, if creativity is the cornerstone of our economic reset, the way we live is changing just as dramatically, and as a consequence. You see, people, thought leaders, gurus, like to tell us that our world has gone global. We live in a global world where place doesn't matter anymore, with fast trains and high-speed rail and great planes and digital technology and our smartphones and computers. Doesn't matter. We've conquered distance, geography. Place and community don't matter anymore. Well, hold on. Tom Friedman tells us the world is flat. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter where you are. At any of the four corners of the world, you can plug and play from anywhere. In fact, the creative age, the knowledge age, the age of the mind has a secondary effect. In fact, for the first time in human history, it makes place and city and community the centerpiece of our economy and society. My dad worked for the same company for his entire life, Victory Optical. Most people of his generation had one job. The corporation defined us. Remember what Kennedy said? What's good for General Motors is good for the country. Now, what's the real social and economic organizing glue? Of course, our companies remain important, but what's the real social and organizing glue? While we're here today in San Diego, what's important is that our communities, our cities, have become the cornerstone of our economy. That's where innovation flows from. That's where jobs flow from. That's what matched the labor market and the job market, people to employment. Our cities and communities have become the social and economic organizing unit of our time. The person who discovered this was a second mentor of mine, the great Jane Jacobs. I got to know Jane in her 80s. She's now deceased. But when I asked her about this, the great theorist of American cities, what she thought her greatest contribution was, she said something very simple. She said, I think I understand and have figured out something that's puzzled all the great economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Alfred Marshall and even Karl Marx. She said, most economists are concerned with efficiency. How do you make a company, an economy run more efficiently? How do you drive down the cost curve? She said, companies do that extraordinarily effectively. But if you want to understand where innovation comes from, if you want to understand where new technology, new companies, and new work comes from, if you want to understand how Steve Jobs and Gates could forge high-tech industries, or you want to understand what makes a great music scene, Steve Jobs said the same thing as Jack White, the great founder of the band The White Stripes. It comes from cities. Cities are the real source of innovation. Cities where people mix and mingle densely and interact. Cities, from our dense cities like New York and London, to areas like La Jolla surrounding the University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, to the Silicon Valley, to Nashville, where Jack White moved. Our cities are communities of interaction. The physicists at the Santa Fe Institute showed us this. And this is an amazing finding, folks. For every species on the earth, from an ant to a mouse to a dog, to us to elephants, as we get bigger, our metabolisms slow down. There's only one organism, if you will, a social organism, whose metabolism gets faster as it gets bigger. That is our cities, our suburbs, and our metropolitan areas. And according to the most recent MIT research published today, it is not just the size and scale of our cities, but our ability to interact. It's not just building vertical skyscraper communities, like some economists suggest, and packing them like Shanghai or Singapore. It's creating cities of interaction, of flexibility, of mixing and matching and combining and recombining. And here we have a few clues about the reset. You see, I told you about the first reset and how we moved from the farm to the factory towns and those small industrial communities, opening up tremendous opportunities for building infrastructure and building homes and building factories and building apartment buildings. I told you about the Great Depression and the crisis of the 30s and how ultimately that opened up new opportunities for building suburban homes on a scale no one had ever anticipated, for building suburban office parks and industrial parks, for building new infrastructure, our great interstate highway system. We're in a period of even greater opportunity now. You might not see it. In fact, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not omniscient. I can't tell you for sure what's going to happen 20 or 30 years from now. What I can tell you is what my dad said to me. When I was a little boy, he sat me down on the stoop of that 1,500 square foot Cape Cod in euphemistically called suburban New Jersey. And he said to me, he was, remember, the 8-year-old boy when the markets crashed, 29, he was 8 years old, bought that house at about 38 or 40. He said, Rich, when I was a kid, this was a farm. And we had no way of getting out here because none of us had cars. Only rich people had cars. Who would have thought that Mom and Dad and Richard and Robert would be living on what was a farm? The scale of that transformation in those 20 or 30 years. Remember, we're 5, 6 years into this reset now. Crisis occurred in 2008. What we are going to live through is going to dwarf that. The way we are going to rebuild our communities, remake our cities. Look what's happened down here. The way we're going to have to rebuild our suburbs, my friends, the smartest urban designers, tell me the most important experiments that we have to go through, and you know this because it's your business, are how are we going to rebuild our suburbs to create the density, the interaction, the connective fiber that will boost their metabolism, that will enable them to attract the creative class. You see, my friends, the urbanists, have it wrong. It's not city versus suburb. Now, it's true. It's true. We are seeing a remarkable back to the city movement. Who? Me. How would I have expected this? I watched Newark clear out. I watched everyone leave. I watched Pittsburgh go from a town of 900,000 people to a town of 330,000 people when I lived there. Yes, Manhattan was vibrant, and yes, downtown San Francisco always had its edge, and yes, Beacon Hill in Boston, and Georgetown in D.C., and you can name a few others. But you know, over the past decade and over the past 3 years, the first time in modern memory, our center cities have outgrown our suburbs. It's hard to believe. You know, over this past decade, our biggest cities and metros have seen double-digit growth in population around the core. You know that 27 of our largest 51 metro areas have seen their downtown inner city areas rebound. And you know what the fastest growth has been? It's not New York. It's not San Francisco. It's Charlotte, New Orleans, Atlanta, Denver, and D.C. And you know what else? What we see in the suburbs, and what I'm sure all of you know, is where the prices remain highest and where they're growing the fastest are in older inner ring suburbs, but not just older inner ring suburbs, suburbs that understand mixed use, interactive communities, walkability, proximity to transit. That's where the prices are going through the roof. You see, I was sitting at a dinner party once. We live in Toronto part of the year, and I was sitting at a dinner party out on the beautiful lakes area of Toronto with my wife. We had a couple, because a lot of New Yorkers send their kids up to camp near the lakes. And there was a couple from New York, one from the city, the east side, and one from Greenwich. Oh, and they had an argument. It was a furious argument between these two couples. I live in the city, and we do this, and we go to restaurants and shows and shops, and but I live in Greenwich, and that has great schools. And I sat there and I listened to this argument going on for 15 minutes. Their kids went to the same schools. They shopped at the same grocery stores. They went to the same restaurants. Although they thought they lived, one was the urban verb and one was the suburban couple, the places they lived were exactly the same. What makes great communities are fundamentals, and we have to get over this nonsensical verbiage. I'm going to write my next book about this. This nonsensical verbiage which says it's city or suburbs, it's city and suburb together. My friend Bruce Katz at Brookings calls it a metro revolution. It's bigger than that. It's a megalopolitan revolution. You know, we're sitting today in one of the world's greatest mega regions that runs from San Diego south to Tijuana, up to Los Angeles, tens of millions of people, hundreds of billions of economic activity. San Francisco in Northern California is another one. The Cascadia area from Portland to Seattle to Vancouver. Boston, New York, Washington. It's not China we're competing with. It's a great mega region from Shanghai to Beijing. It's not India that's the new competitor. It's the axis from Bangalore to Mumbai. Similarly with Brazil. It's the Rio, Sao Paulo area. We have to build functional mega regions. We have to create density and interaction and hubs of activity. Look, the way we house our people is changing, and it's not a dramatic shift, but I have to share this with you. The shift we saw in our housing market after the Depression is quite illustrative. When we went into the Depression, 40 to 45% of Americans owned single-family homes. You all know this. During the course of the Great Boom, which my father and all of us and our grandparents and parents participated in, we boosted that to near 70%. It's changing again. But it's not going to go back to 40 or 45%. It's tilting backward to about 60 or 62%. In fact, what we're talking about is communities which have vibrant single-family markets, which have vibrant condo markets, and which have vibrant rental markets all together. What we find, and those of you in California should know this better than anyone, with your housing prices. What we find is the most vibrancy, if you're looking at vibrancy and innovation and economic output and a higher standard of living, comes not out of places where the rate of home ownership is 80%. I hate to tell you those are the most stodgy and stagnant communities. The most vibrant communities are not those with 20% or 25%. It's where that rate of single-family home ownership hits a point of about 55% in places like San Francisco, in places like Los Angeles, in places like Washington, D.C., and I could go on and on. That is the magic number that we are tilting back towards. Why? Because it's an economic necessity, because that mixture of uses and mixture of types and creating those kinds of communities that provide those options, low-end rental, mid-end rental, high-end rental, low-end condo, mid-end condo, and single family. And of course we have to understand in America, which is different than Toronto, where my wife and I spend a good part of the year, because of our schools problems in the urban center, many of our cities will continue to have a barbell demography. They will continue to be homes to the young and the dynamic and the entrepreneurial, and not just the childless, to people who have kids. I call them the strollervilles, the places you see lots of young families pushing the strollers. And then they'll be home to the empty nesters and the retirees. As young families decamp, many of them, and those who can't afford private schools, to the suburbs, but not just any kind of suburb. The suburbs of choice now are the suburbs of vibrancy, of excitement, that bring a level of urbanity, that bring access to transit. Transit access boosts prices and creates extraordinary premia. The reconstruction and the reconfiguration of communities. We see this in the Bay Area. You see it in Greater Washington, D.C., and Alexandria, and Arlington, and Bethesda. I could go on and on and on. And in the cities, bringing a little bit of a green lifestyle. You see it in what Mike Bloomberg's done in New York. You know, people often say San Francisco or Seattle or San Diego need to be more Manhattan-like. At the same time, what Mike Bloomberg understood is Manhattan needs to be more San Diego or Seattle or San Francisco-like, adding access to the waterfront, adding green belts where people can go out and recharge their batteries. When I ask members of the creative class in an urban environment what they most want to see is the ability to access green space. Now, with the Gallup organization, we did a study. We probed 100,000 Americans on what they desire in their community. City, suburb, rural, exurb. We probed every income group, every race and ethnicity, and what we learned was remarkable. What people want, regardless of what type of community they prefer, whether they're an urbanite, a suburbanite, a ruralite, or an exurbanite, what they prefer in a community is all the same. I call it the pyramid of place. It's like Maslow, the great psychologist, hierarchy of needs. At the bottom, we need a safe and secure and crime-free environment. Without that, we got nothing. We're back to the subsistence age. At the second level of the pyramid, we need lots of great economic opportunity. We're not one company career men like my dad. I've changed jobs and houses 20 times. 20 times since I left graduate school. The average American under 30 today changes jobs year by year. The most important decision we make is not the work we do. I wrote about this in a book called Who's Your City? It's the places we live, because that structures our access to professional networks and career opportunity, especially if we're in a two-person household. But the top two parts of the pyramid were the surprise for us and my colleagues at Gallup. The two things that distinguish the great communities, that create emotional attachment, that people want to live in, will move to, and will attract their family and friends. The second highest ranked factor was the open-mindedness and tolerance of that town. How open it was not only for my group, middle-aged white, Italian-American white men, how open it was for all groups, the communities where each and every group, the gay community, poor people, entrepreneurs, young people, old people, racially diverse people, people by different levels of education, where they said our community is good for everyone, those communities where diverse people could feel like they could make a difference, had the highest levels of satisfaction and emotional attachment. But what was at the top of the pyramid is something all of us, all of you in this room, can help to build, can help control, and can help to spearhead. It has to be our mission. The top of the pyramid we called quality of place. Note we didn't call it quality of life. Think about that. Quality of place. Remember that. Quality of place. The quality of the place itself in a world, in a global world, and I teach kids from all over the world. They dress the same. They eat the same food. We drive the same cars. We use the same smartphones. It is not my dad's world where when you went around the world, everyone was different and had their own cuisine and own look and own cars and own... No. We live in a world where everything is pretty much shared and generic. When people are looking at a place to visit or a place to live, they want something authentic and real and unique that speaks to their soul. I call it quality of place. And quality of place has several dimensions. One dimension that we have to be cognizant of is the importance of protecting our natural environment. It's not my father's age of a polluted industrial area or the blackened buildings of Pittsburgh and work hard to get ahead. People across the spectrum want to live in a green community, not just because they can say it's green, so their children can play in great parks, so their kids can enjoy access to the waterfront. So if there are mountains there, they can be used. This ability to attach to nature, not just the natural environment, the built environment. Protecting historic assets, creating districts like right here in the Gaslamp, making sure there's a place and an entertainment place that's real and vibrant. And that goes not only of urban centers, it goes for great suburbs. And finally, the social offerings. The ability to have social and cultural offerings and amenity. The ability to have great, not only great high art and cultural institutions, a thriving music scene. What we found in our research is communities like the Bay Area, like San Francisco, or Austin, Texas, or Seattle, having that thriving music scene often predates and presages the rise of entrepreneurship. Well, I'm a professor, which means I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, which means I could keep you here all day. I want to end with a short story of someone who's actually doing this. And there are others, and I'm going to profile all of them in my next book, but I want to end with one because he's close to here and close to home. A couple of years ago, a young man named Tony Shea called me up. Tony is a young Asian-American kid, dropped out of Harvard, founded a software company, and then went on to become the CEO of his friend's company, Zappos. He turned Zappos, the places that sell shoes online, into a multi-billion-dollar company that he sold to Amazon. The reason Tony called me is because he had his headquarters out in suburban Henderson, Las Vegas. And what he found is that location in Henderson was expensive. And when he polled his workforce, they gave him a laundry list of functions that they would like in a corporate location. They wanted on-site food and on-site gyms and on-site healthcare and on-site daycare and all the things that you can imagine employees talked about. Tony calculated that would be very, very expensive to do in Henderson. So he went out and did something rash. He bought the old Las Vegas City Hall. And he decided to rebuild, and this is what Dan Gilbert is doing in Detroit for the same reasons. He decided to build his new campus in downtown Las Vegas, except it wouldn't be a campus. Because building a campus was too expensive, and that's why he talked to me and wanted to talk to us at the Creative Class Group to help him understand what to put inside the workforce and what to put outside. And the quote that he said is amazing. He said, "I came to understand that it wasn't a corporate campus I had to build. It was a city." And that's the key, and it can be in the suburbs or in the urban center. But what he had to do was not only bring his offices down there, and he set up a $350 million real estate fund to do this, was to animate the community, the sort of thing you take for granted here in the gas lamp, the sort of thing those of you from San Francisco or LA take for granted downtown or in Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. But he had to do it in the tough section, off the strip, in the Fremont area of Las Vegas, shops and bars and restaurants and housing. And here's what he figured out. If he was in the center, it's the same thing Dan Gilbert figured out in Detroit. If he was in the center or close to transportation routes, he could not only make a dynamic campus for innovators and techies, he can make a better way of life for his people. Fewer of them needed to own a car. They certainly didn't need to own 2 or 3. And that car ownership was what puts a lot of families over the brink financially. It's not their housing, it's their car and fuel payment. He needed to provide lower cost housing and shared accommodation. Shared accommodation for his young workers who could then bank more of their money. He began to turn those low-wage service workers making 20, 25, 30, 35 to enable them to stretch their paycheck. You see, that's the kind of community building all of us have to be engaged in. It's not enough to just stay in our silos. We all have to experience that great reset. We all have to harness that creativity. And why I'm so honored and privileged to address all of you is because each and every one of you and this group is going to be at the forefront of this change. I hope my remarks are of some use. If you need to contact me in the future, I'm easy to get. Florida@creativeclass.com. Best of luck with your conference and your deliberations.
Ah, yes. Well, looky here, ah, what do we have? Another pretty thing ready for me to grab. But little does she know that I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing, 'cause at the end of the night, it is her I'll be holding. I love you so, hey, that's what you'll say. You'll tell me, baby, baby, please don't go away.